Hey, this is Josh. Welcome back to just another edition of weekly power rankings, or less power rankings and more just a couple of teams to keep an eye on. Some teams that have really shown some flashes and risen up the ranks, and then some other teams that are really heading in the opposite direction. So for this past week, which was October 30th to today, November 6th, I want to talk about some of my risers first. And I think the big one that stands out right now is Atlanta. The Hawks are 3-0 against the other 10 teams right now that have winning records entering week 3. According to NBA.com, no other team is better than even 2-2 against top 10 teams. And after the Hawks started 0-2, they've won 4 straight. 3 of those wins have come against teams that also have winning records through week 2, those being Milwaukee, Minnesota, and New Orleans. And in those 4 games, they have a net rating of plus 14.8. And specifically, they really found something with the lineup of DeJounte Murray, Trae Young, DeAndre Hunter, Clint Capella, and Jalen Johnson. That 5-man lineup is a plus 19.8 in 47 minutes over those 4 games. And what's remarkable about all this is that the Hawks are doing this despite Trae not having found his shot whatsoever so far. His expected effective field goal percentage, or shot quality per PVP stats, is 50%, yet his actual effective field goal percentage is under 40% at 39.9. And despite this, the Hawks are still a plus 7.6 when he's on the floor, and that's thanks in part to him averaging 24.7 assist points per game, which is a number that would be a career high if he can sustain this over a full year. And what's interesting is his offensive load metrics, which are typically very high, are the lowest they've been since his rookie year, because Atlanta is still really good when Trae sits, and they have a really well-rounded offensive roster. DeJounte Murray, specifically as of today, is leading the league in mid-range shooting. He's hitting numbers north of 53% from 10 to 19 feet. And the Hawks are actually at their absolute best when Jalen Johnson is on the floor. He just dropped a 21-11 game the other day with 4 assists. The Hawks are plus 19.1 when he's on the floor, and that drops to a minus 10.4 when he sits. That's nearly a 30-point on-off swing. They have Orlando and Miami this week. Wins against those 2 teams would really establish them as the best team in the Southeast early this year. So the Hawks are my main riser. A few other teams to keep an eye on. Dallas, the Mavericks have been borderline unsustainably hot in close games this year. They're 5-0 in clutch games and just have an absurd net rating. That's thanks to Luka. Luka is leading the league in clutch scoring right now. He's one of 6 players with at least 20 clutch points. It's him, Steph, Donovan Mitchell, LeBron, Wemby, and Damian Lillard. And the Mavs offense has been consistent. They're scoring between 115 to 124 points per 100, but they're feasting on some pretty poor defenses right now, and that should change. They're going to play Orlando, Toronto, and the LA Clippers this week. That's 3 top 10 defenses, so I'm really excited to see how the Dallas offense fares against them. Speaking of defense, up next I got the Minnesota Timberwolves. They have the #1 defense so far this year, and this is despite playing some elite offenses recently in Atlanta and Denver. Jaden McDaniels is back. Ant is getting hot after a slow shooting start, and plus the Karl Anthony Towns and Rudy Gobert combo was actually really positive this past week. So I like where Minnesota is going. And the last team that I want to keep an eye on, of course, is San Antonio, the team that everyone's talking about. Interesting tidbit per NBA.com: after their 2 big wins against Phoenix this last week, San Antonio blew that big game against Toronto the other day. And with Devin Vassell suffering an injury, the Spurs had an opportunity to put a point guard in their starting lineup, but instead they went with Malachi Branham, and he had a good game against the Raptors. He shot 8 for 9, but the loss was still the Spurs' 2nd worst offensive performance of the season, and they've scored just 94.8 points per 100 possessions in the 127 minutes with Jeremy Sohan on the floor without Trae Jones. Now, speaking of Wemby, we're all in awe over Wemby's offensive explosion versus the Suns the other night, but his defense has been elite as advertised. Opponents are shooting just 26% effective field goal percentage against him, which is 23% worse than what their expected number would be per second spectrum. But despite that, the Spurs defense still sucks. It's league average when Wemby's on the floor, and that drops to a league worst when he's off the floor. So you still want to see maybe some better pieces around him, maybe get some vets on the Spurs roster. Another interesting conundrum with the Spurs, they are a plus 24.5 when Wemby and Trey Jones share the floor without Jeremy Sohan. And they're a minus 31.3 when Wemby and Sohan share the floor and Trey Jones sits. I'm just saying. Now, some of my followers, my biggest follower this week is Phoenix. The Suns season has been pretty spotty so far. Booker's been in and out of the lineup. We haven't even seen Bradley Beal yet. The Suns lost that killer game to the Spurs on Halloween when they failed to box out Wemby on the putback dunk that preceded the Keldon Johnson steal on Kevin Durant. And then they lost again to them a couple of days later by 11 points, despite that game being tied with about 4 minutes left. The Suns are 1-3 in clutch games this year. So far, of all teams to have played in at least 4 clutch games, they by far have the worst net rating at minus 36.7. The Suns have been getting to the line at a good rate and have had some decent shooting games, but they don't really force a lot of turnovers, and opponents had an effective field goal percentage of 56% against them this past week, which is a bottom 8 number in the league. KD is really the main offensive creator and initiator without Booker or Beal, and his efficiency is really suffering for it. This season, KD has a relative true shooting percentage of plus 4.7 above the league average, a number that, if that holds up over the whole year, would be the lowest he's had since the 2008-2009 season, which is his second year in the league and the first year that the Thunder even existed as a franchise. Only 18% of his shots have come from 3 this year, which is a near 10% drop-off in three-point rate from last year and the year before. Despite that, the Suns are relying heavily on him, and he still has a very positive on-off swing at plus 12.2. A couple other teams that are falling, first and foremost, Sacramento. They're 0-2 since Fox has been out and are only 2-3, despite having held double-digit leads in 4 of their 5 games. The Kings' offense has been pretty average. And it's apparent Fox's absence is the key reason for that. The Kings really benefited from good health last year, and it's clear that if they regress to the mean in any sort of significant way, then the Kings might be in for a bit of a long season. Next team, Detroit, which was my riser last week. They've really fallen back to earth. They're still very sloppy on offense with the ball, despite forcing a good amount of turnovers on defense. But this is a team that's sorely missing its vets for some stabilization. We've seen some good flashes from Cade. We've seen some good flashes from Oscar Thompson and Jalen Duren, but they could really use some stabilization from guys like Bojan Bogdanovic, Monty Morris, and Alec Burks.